Thank you, Jason. Couldn't unmute it first. Do want to welcome everybody back tonight. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Really appreciated all the participation last week, so would love for that to continue this week as well. So please use the chat window and the Q&A as we go through tonight. But again, tonight's webinar is made possible by a grant from the Foundation for Evangelism, where for over 70 years we've been a catalyst to equip disciples to share the good news of Jesus Christ, and do that in three primary ways: raising up gospel leaders, equipping the local church, and engaging the ministry of the laity. Now, one of the ways that we have been raising up gospel leaders for some time now, several decades now, and one of our most impactful programs has been the establishment of the E. Stanley Jones Professors of Evangelism. Priscilla Pope-Levison, who presented last week, isn't currently in one of those chairs, but was several years ago and has remained a good friend of the foundation. And these professors were established to ensure quality evangelism training as part of clergy formation. And so we're thrilled tonight to have one of our other E. Stanley Jones Professors of Evangelism share tonight, and that's Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Conklin-Miller, who has that chair as well as is the Royce and Jane Reynolds Teaching Fellow at Duke Divinity School, and is also an author, and has recently published the book Leaning Both Ways at Once. And so tonight, I know we'll be blessed to hear what Jeff has to share with us, both from his experience as a local church pastor, and then also his years in theological education. So welcome, Jeff. We're so glad that you're with us tonight. And we'll go ahead and give everybody your contact information here that they can see, and a picture of the cover of your new book that folks can, I'm sure, are going to want to run out and get following this webinar.
Yes, I hope you can stay to the end and not rush out too quickly. So can I start? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Heather, for the introduction, and to the foundation for the opportunity to be here with you and to share in this time about this work, and hopefully to have some conversation. I think that'd be my hope, would be to hear from you, and hopefully have some meaningful engagement around what I hope are some interesting and some provocative and some important ideas as we try together to do the work that we're called to do in witness to the gospel in the world, in the work of evangelism. So why don't I start? I might just start by offering just a brief introduction maybe to some of the background of the book, like where did this come from? And frankly, in one measure, I might say it came from lots of years of study and reading and writing. But in truth, the beginning of this book really started when I was a pastor. I was a pastor for 11 years in churches in Southern California, and came into ministry about the same time the church, at least in Southern California, really discovered, the mainline church, the United Methodist Church, really discovered that it no longer had the kind of cultural centrality that it once did. What does it mean for us to be a church in this place now? And how do we grow again after we've faced so much loss over time, where our churches have grown smaller? How do we re-engage with our communities and find new people to come and to be a part of these places? So I engaged everything I could at that time in learning about congregational development and church planting and renewal, and learned strategies from the best mega churches that were quite literally down the street from where our congregation was located. And we began to employ some of these practices in the church, right? Like we began to introduce for the first time video in worship, which now seems like something that is the way it's always been. But there was a time this didn't exist. Just employing some of these other church growth strategies, we discovered, frankly, that many of them could work. We found ways that people would come into the church, they would attend more regularly, they were a part of the community. We also discovered that there's a difference between congregational growth in worship attendance and the formation of faithful disciples of Jesus Christ. And we found kind of the hard way that people who came in the front door to visit, because we discovered these ways that we might be more attractional and more inviting, we also discovered those people found a way out of the congregation within the next year because there just wasn't enough that we provided to engage their formation in discipleship. All that is to say that created some crisis for me, right? What do we think we're doing here? What does it mean that we're engaged in this work, not just trying to recruit members, but to develop Christians? And what difference does it make that we're Methodists in this work? I mean, what's distinctive about being a Wesleyan Christian? And I started to imagine that these were theological questions, and started to read a little bit more, and began to think that these were questions about the identity and the nature and the purpose of the church, and was engaging at that time what was a relatively new conversation in the North American church around what we now know as the missional church. What does it mean to call the church missional, and to have the church re-engage its calling to be a missional body? I called up a professor, an old professor of mine from seminary. I just needed to pose these questions and figure out, what kind of question am I asking? What am I trying to study in engaging these issues? I said, I'm interested in theology, but I'm not looking to do systematic theology. And these seem to be questions about ethics in some ways, about the church's work in the world, but I'm not specifically asking ethics-oriented questions, am I? Is this a kind of practical theology, and should I engage further study in that particular discipline? And I'm a Methodist. I mean, is this a form of Wesley studies? Is this a conversation about Methodist theology? And my professor told me that I think you're describing questions that actually are the study of evangelism. And I thought to myself, there's no possible way that could be true. How could this be about evangelism? I don't even really think about evangelism. It's not something I was trained to imagine, oddly, about the way that we engage these questions in the church. But I began to reach out to some other E. Stanley Jones professors who were in office at that time, and had some wonderful conversations, and started to do some more reading. And I discovered, indeed, this is about evangelism. So in summary, I just want to say, I think this book, I hope it really comes out of what was my experience of pastoral ministry. And in some ways, my concern about that experience, about the church's at times unquestioned embrace of attractional church growth strategies, and a failure to articulate a truly theological, articulated Wesleyan Methodist vision for who we are and why we're placed here to do ministry. And so maybe in short, I'd say I hope I wrote this book because I wanted, like I did, to help pastors know who we are and what we're here to do. So just sort of leaning a little more into the content of the book then. I mean, as an introduction to the book, I suggest in a sense through the whole book that I think to talk about evangelism meaningfully requires our engagement with, I think, at least three important theological questions. And you've heard me mention them already, right? What is the church? What is the world? And what is the church's relationship to its context, to the world? To lean into those questions, I start with a story about a cathedral in the UK, pre-pandemic in England, Norwich Cathedral, and a picture of that you can see on the screen. A beautiful cathedral. Unfortunately, I've never been there. I've seen pictures of it, but a fantastic Norman architecture, started to be built in 1096, completed 49 years later in 1145. A beautiful example of the image that comes to mind in a kind of paradigmatic way, at least for some, when you think of the word church. Now, the story is that a couple of years ago, one of the staff at the cathedral thought that one way he might get more people inside the building, to see the building, to appreciate its architecture, and maybe even to stay and to worship in the building, would be to install a carnival ride inside the cathedral. And so that's what they did. You can see a picture of it right there. In the nave of the cathedral, they installed a helter-skelter, right? Which is a 40-foot tall sort of circular slide. And it looks, as you can tell, like it came from the carnival, right? I mean, this was a ride that they were able to build inside of this building because of its, of course, great size. And it did some work. I caught news of it because it was in the media. As you might imagine, it was received in wildly different ways. How would you think this was received? And regardless of however you answer that question, you're right, because the responses were in essence of opposite kinds, right? Some loved it. They thought it was a fantastic idea. Here's a beautiful way that we're connecting the church to the world, to its community, and helping others outside the church to find their way inside the church, right? Perhaps for the first time, and to discover the ways that this is maybe a ministry of hospitality. We're strengthening our welcome for others to come and to find their way into this holy space. But of course, some hated it. I mean, such a carnival monstrosity, they suggested, has no place in such a sacred space. And to have it included in here, not just only soils the holiness of the space, but it harms the church's witness to the world. If we represent as the church nothing more to the world as yet another kind of entertainment venue, then we're no longer a church. We're something else entirely. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this example, at least for my purposes, is to see that both responses here to this particular instance might be deployed to support an argument about the church's witness, about what evangelism requires. So who's right? I use this to get into the question, I think, for us to say that we can't engage evangelism meaningfully, properly, without some consideration of these theological questions regarding the church and the world, the identity and the agency of both. So let's talk a little bit about the world. What are we talking about when we talk about the world? I mean, the identity of the world is given to us, right? First and foremost in Genesis 1, the world is creation. This is the theological way we understand the identity of the world. The creation in all of its intricacy and beauty, there's nothing in the creation that has not been called good by its creator. And if the world is creation, we certainly are a part of the world. We are a part of creation. We are creatures. And so we have to acknowledge that creation is God's work and God has called it good. But at the same time, we also claim, don't we, that the world is not only good, but also the world is fallen. The brokenness of the world is unfortunately also on full display for us. I mean, we see it every day. The failure of institutions and organizations, communities and governments, economies, the failure runs all the way down. It's obvious and it's evident and it's painful. So we make this claim when we talk about the world to say that the world is at once both good, yet fallen, and of course, still in God's grace, also being redeemed and reconciled. And so this is to acknowledge, as I'm sure you've heard before, that we live in this in-between time in the world, this moment between the now and the not yet of God's eventual reign and the restoration of all good in the creation that is to come, the promised kingdom of God. But in this moment when we live now, we live between the goodness and the fallenness of the world. Okay, now if we're that far, we can say, or now the question, why does this matter for a conversation about evangelism? And the question I want to pose here is simply to ask, is the way that we are in the world and the way that we're sent to the world somehow influenced not only by who we are as the church, but also somehow by the fact that we are a part of this good and yet fallen world? How are we shaped? How are we formed in the church by the world? Now, just for an example of this, I do a little bit of work on kind of unpacking this in the book, but at least in North American contexts, one of the most important ways the world is the way in which the world trains us in particular contexts in what we would call market-based economies to think of ourselves first and foremost, whether consciously or unconsciously, as consumers. We're people who buy and exchange goods in a market economy. That's the way it works. And so just as an example, there was a time, probably beyond all of our memories, that if you went to the grocery store and you went to the grocery store to buy mustard, when you went to the grocery store, there was one thing that you saw when you got there, and this was it, right? There was one kind of mustard you could buy at the store. The consumer only required one because that's all that was available. But now times have changed. And now if you go to the store for mustard and you stand in front of the grocery aisle where the mustard is located, you are paralyzed with choice. I mean, how do you decide what kind of mustard you're supposed to buy for the particular kind of meal that you're trying to have? I mean, who knows? Who knows how many different kinds of mustard there could possibly be in the world? We went somehow from being given the sort of one kind of choice to more choices than anyone could ever imagine dealing with. And the point, of course, is that this choice is indeed, I used the word paralyzing a second ago, it is paralyzing. It's paralyzing, but in a sense, it's what the consumer demands. What we want constantly are new and more and better options, new and greater possibilities for what we can purchase in order to take unto ourselves to get what we think we want or what we need. This is, in essence, the training that a consumer economy affects. And I suggest in the book, in essence, that this is a kind of formation that is a part of life in a good and yet fallen world. An economy is good. In God's economy, God hopes for all to have what they need and to thrive and flourish. But in the formation of a fallen economy in a fallen world, in a market-based economy, the way things work, consumer demand reigns. And this finds its way somehow into the life of the church. What happens to the church when it decides to borrow from the world that shapes consumer mentality in order to fuel its evangelistic witness? And we know the answer to that question, right? You've surely seen this picture before, right? The church board on the street of the Church of the Sacred Consumer, Consumerist Church of the Sacred Demographic, right? The church can lean so far into the world that the church ceases to appear any longer as a church, right? The church participates now, at least given this particular example, it participates in a market economy in a way that it tries to be in competition with other forms of business that compete equally for consumer attention in the market-based economy. Other businesses that compete for people's allegiance and money and support and engagement, and other churches that employ the practices of market economy to try to woo consumers to their place, to their context, to their location. When we lean into this, I don't imagine there's anybody that's entirely comfortable with this. I mean, looking at it the way that we are. And it begs the question of whether what we're talking about now is truly evangelism. Is this what we mean when we talk about the word evangelism? What's the difference then between what we think of as evangelism and what we think of as a pitch for membership recruitment? And how do we differentiate between what we mean by those very different terms? In fact, in the book, I make some mention of the fact that the term evangelism and evangelist, as you probably can think of as examples yourself, are terms that have been deployed, utilized, taken up by the secular business community to talk about a sort of ramped up form of sales work, right? I use an example in the book of an advertisement I found in a totally secular hiring context for a consumer evangelist. And the point was someone who's passionate about the product and can sell it with conviction and meaning. I struggle with this, but this is in some ways the way the world forms our identity and our agency when it comes to thinking about evangelism. I'm trying to raise, at least for us, some question about what that actually means in our life together as church. Now, I think it's probably worthwhile stopping at least briefly for a moment, just to pose a couple of questions and invite you to chew on that for a second and maybe even give some feedback. I mean, and the first question is, there's at least on the screen, right? Mm-hmm. Where have you seen the consumerist church of the sacred demographics? You know, where have you experienced the church sort of catering to a world of consumers? Is that an experience that you've seen? Or secondly, where do you, beyond the sort of consumerist model that I'm sort of focused on, where else does the church allow the world to dictate its identity and its agency? And how does that inhibit the way we think about Christian witness or evangelism? I'm happy for us to talk about that.
Yeah, so if you have some thoughts, go ahead and enter them in the chat window. But it's interesting, Jeff, I was actually in a meeting earlier today where we were talking about expectations that we have as Christians and of our churches and how low we set the bar. And it has to do with your what you were talking about with discipleship, that we really don't expect transformation. we really, come and join us, but we really don't, one, expect transformation, really have a lot of accountability in place or ways for people to measure whether they're growing more in the likeness of Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and it's of course counterintuitive to the sort of consumer approach in a sense, right? Which lowering the bar is the best we can do in order to make sure people find their way into our space. And I realize that we're talking a lot here about this what is a sort of dominant attractional model that we, in some measure, are really trying to sort of slide out of, I think, as a church. But I don't want to let go of the fact that this is it's not just a strategy, but it's a way in which we're formed to imagine what the ministry of the church as evangelism ought to look like. And it takes all different kinds of forms in the way that we structure our life together. Mm-hmm. So I'm taking a look at the chat window. If you see my eyes sort of pivot off the camera. So yeah, I think the comment about mega churches and the use of market strategy, there's some sense in which these tools are given, are deployed in a very particular way with a great deal of intent for the purpose of engaging populations that are not already a part of the church. And I struggle with this a little bit when I teach class in evangelism, because we talk about the use of demographic resources in the work of planning and practice in evangelistic ministry in a congregation. Is it right or wrong to use these kinds of tools? And I don't want to suggest, I think, that that's the question. I want to suggest that we have to interrogate these tools and make sure that we put them in the right place, right? That we're understanding that demographics may be helpful to us. But at the same time, if demographics are only representative of particular populations that are able to be visible to demographers because of their participation in the market economy, who's missing from the data? Because they don't participate in the market economy, because they may not own a home or live in a home, because they may have a migrant life, because they may not have credit. These are just kind of some examples, right? To then say, there's also, alongside the work of demographics, the necessity of using your eyes and to travel the neighborhood and to have some sense of, embodiment. Who are we and where are we in this community? It's not just about the numbers.
Yeah, and I wonder too, because yes, entry points into the church have changed. So I think that does require us to be creative. But a lot of times we're not ready for folks once they come, or we don't have a pathway for them to grow in their faith, which is Wesleyan, right? That we invite people to continue into a life of sanctification and growing in love of God and neighbor. So it's not just how do we attract them, but again, do we have a plan for once they do come?
Yeah, I think that's true. In some ways, I wonder if that maybe leans us into the next stage of the book, because I think in some ways I'm hoping that's where the conversation goes. Because we talked about the world but now we need to sort of focus on the church. What is the church? And if the church is, as one professor of evangelism once suggested, one of the agents of evangelism, alongside, of course, the primary evangelist, God, the Spirit, but alongside the work of God in the evangelist and the evangelized, the church is also an agent in the work of evangelism. What does that mean? How do we talk about the church as an agent? What is the church and what does it do? Now, of course, there are several definitions for what we could think of as what makes a church. But for the sake of articulating here in a theology of evangelism, in the book, I take it as crucial, central, frankly, that we speak about the church, particularly as Wesleyan Methodists, as the formation of a particular people called Methodist. Now, that's a term or a phrase that sometimes gets deployed in the tradition, the Methodist tradition, the Wesleyan tradition, right? That there is a people called Methodist, a people sort of plural, that have this identity as Methodist. We become a part of this particular peoplehood called Methodist when we find ourselves formed or shaped into the ways of life in this very particular kind of community. Now, for Methodists, we're familiar with the ways that we shape that kind of community. And this goes exactly to what I think Heather is talking about and what I think I was missing in my sort of original experimentation in pastoral ministry with these church growth strategies. And it was about focusing, of course, on the practices that shape faithful discipleship. For Methodists, we're familiar with the ways that we shape Christian identity, right? It's adherence to the general rules, participation in the Methodist society, particularly the work of the class meeting, or what we might now think of as a kind of small group, where there's accountability and there's engagement with Christian practices and encouragement to engaging these, what we, of course, we call the means of grace, right? The practices of piety and mercy that shape Christian character and that form a life that we call holy, and a people that we think of as holy. And of course, holiness is one of the dimensions that we speak of in regards to the identity of the church creedally. So this is to say that when we talk about the church, in one sense, here we lean into God, right? The church's identity is grounded in its connection, of course, to God and God's grace, in scripture and tradition, and the practices of the church that shape Christian discipleship. But if this describes the identity of the church, we also want to talk a little bit about the agency of the church. You know, what does the church do in the world? If the church is this particular people, what is the church then called to do and to be when it's engaged in the world? And in short, I mean, what I'd probably say is that what the church does in the world, in its broadest sense, is best described as evangelism. But of course, to get at that broader sense of what I mean by evangelism, I use another term to describe the evangelistic work of the church. And in the book, I call it intercession, or an intercessory evangelism. All right, here's another term. So what do we mean by intercession, right? I mean, intercession in one frame, given our knowledge of the history and the tradition of the church, is that the intercession is the work of saints and angels, those who stand between us in the world and God. Those who intercede, right? Or who get involved with God on our behalf. And of course, we know that term perhaps even more definitively because we practice something we think of as intercessory prayer. I mean, this is the ubiquitous way in which we think of what intercession embodies, right? It's the promise that we make to one another when we say to each other, I'll pray for you. I'll keep you in my prayers. I will lift you up to the love and the care of God. And I will hold you close to me and hope that God will also hold you close in this moment in your life. I will intercede for you. I want to take that term and I want to sort of blow it up just a little bit more widely and to think about the ways in which that says something important to us about what we might think of as the church's work, the church's agency, the church's work as a people of God in the world, as evangelism, intercession. Now, I borrow this in a way from another theologian, Rowan Williams, a former Archbishop of Canterbury. But I think meaningfully, I think we can take this term and apply it to evangelism in ways that I think lead to some very fruitful ways we can think about the embodied ministry of the church as expressions of evangelism all over and all the way down. This is, of course, is where the title inevitably of my book comes from, right? That intercession in evangelism, describing our calling as the church in the world, is always this work of leaning both ways at once. Where the church stands is always, in one sense, always leaning into the world, but at the same time, doing the impossible, which is to lean another direction at once, at the same time, to lean into God. And so the church is, of course, not called to be separate from the world. It couldn't possibly be. The church is a part of the world. It's located in the world. It's inevitably of the world and engaged with the world. But in the world, the church's task as an intercessor, as a practice of evangelism in intercessory terms, the church's task is to bring the world's pain and the world's brokenness to God. and to hope once again in the transforming work of God's Spirit that has been a part of the story of God's work from the beginning of creation through Israel and Christ and in the life and birth of the church at Pentecost, and is promised to come into its fruition in the kingdom of God. This is what we participate in this moment when we find who we are as a people of God, living this intercessory life as the church. We're leaning into the world and carrying the pain and the worst of the world to God in hope of God's transformation, and to participate in that transformation. And that is to say then, of course, that the church is called to be in the world, bringing the promise of God in Christ through the Spirit to the world as a word of hope and peace, a word that we articulate with our mouths in proclamation, in our actions, of course, in our embodied witness as a community, as individuals, and as a people, in all the ways the church is engaged in the work of service and justice and peace and frankly, protest. These are ways in which we intercede, we stand between God and the world and bring the pain of the world to God and the hope of God to the world. And so that is simply to say, without, I guess, getting any more homiletic than I already have, that leaning both ways at once is the evangelistic stance of the church in relationship to the world. Now, what kind of work do I hope this might do? I mean, I hope that some of this helps us to kind of overcome some of the problematic dualisms, the conflicts that sometimes we face in conversations about the content and the meaning of evangelism in relationship to the wholeness of the ministry and the mission of the church, right? To think about evangelism as intercession, leaning both ways into God and into the world, is a frame, I think, that helps us get past some of these dualisms. Like, for instance, the most famous and the most enduring, I think, for us, is the church's primary calling to evangelism or to social witness. Is the church's calling to primarily make disciples of Jesus Christ or to transform the world? And of course, everyone knows the answer to that question is always, well, yes. The church is always called to all of those things. The church is never called to none of those things. There's no excuse to leave one behind. It's not a matter of ordering necessarily either, where one comes before the other. I think as James Logan, who's one of the professors of evangelism at Wesley Seminary for so many years, put it, that discipleship and evangelism, of course, are really two sides of the same coin. These commitments in the Wesleyan tradition to witness, to holiness and reform are, of course, embedded in the very DNA of the Methodist movement, and they can never be separated. This, of course, is in some sense who we are. But here, I think I want to offer an image that simply writes that on our hearts in a new way. To say what is not necessarily new, but something that we have to continually be reminded of, that our task, of course, is to figure what it means to live at that intersection always, which is then to say the church is always leaning both ways at once when it's fully the church and it's practicing evangelism at its heart, that it's deeply committed to the practices of holiness, of forming and shaping by the work of the Spirit, sanctification and holiness in the life of the Christian community, in the peoplehood called Methodist, and in the practices, therefore, of worship and Christian formation. That becomes a crucial element of who we are and are always called to be. And at the exact same time, right, that we are also called as the church to be deeply committed to the practices of service, and striving for justice and wholeness and flourishing for all people, but also for all of creation. And that is also an expression of our evangelistic witness, the overflow of the good news of the gospel that shapes us into a holy people that lean, of course, into God and into the world, hopefully to bring a word of hope. Now, so as to not allow this to be a conversation that just lives in the realm of the interesting idea, I bring up an example of what I think is a really interesting embodiment of this leaning both ways at once, sort of near the end of the book. And I share an example of evangelism as intercession, the way I'm thinking about it, in an initiative I sort of stumbled on through a friend who is a part of this congregation at Los Altos United Methodist Church, which is a church in the California-Nevada Annual Conference, Northern California. Dr. Kim Jones is my friend who's directing this initiative under the leadership of Pastor Kathy McShane at this church at Los Altos. And it's called the Changemaker Initiative. The Changemaker Initiative is this experiment that this congregation is pursuing, creating an initiative in what's called social innovation, right? Launching a wide variety of initiatives following deep engagement with the realities of the community where this church is located and where it serves. Launching initiatives to address a wide variety of people's needs and community needs in the church, in families, in the church and outside of the church, in the community at large, and in schools and in workplaces. And what happened once they began to engage this work of stoking this social imagination for what could be innovative and what could be engaged from the church in regards to engaging these contexts, families and community, church, school, and workplaces, what was remarkable was this absolute panoply, this range of new initiatives and services and forms of outreach shaped by members of this congregation. Now, some might look at this and they might dismiss it, right? They might say, okay, it's interesting work, but it's not evangelism, right? It's the church's good work. It's a form of the church's social witness, and maybe it's even a kind of outreach programming. I mean, that'd be where we would apply it sort of in our committee structure in our congregation. But it's not necessarily evangelism, is it not necessarily sort of forming Christian holiness and Christian witness? Those things are different, right? And I want to suggest, I think that they're not. I think that what you see in the initiative is evangelism in an intercessory way, in an intercessory embodiment, right? A leaning between God and the world both ways at once. There were these amazing outcomes that followed, and I borrowed a slide from their website just to share some of these with you. You, of course, can go to their website, and I hope that you will, just to learn more about what they're doing and to see how maybe this is something you can adopt in your context potentially. But the outcomes I thought were very interesting. Were not just to talk about the social impact these efforts had in the community, right? But that members of the congregation discovered new ways to talk about their faith, and perhaps even a new willingness to talk about their faith, given these experiences. They became more engaged in the ministry and the mission of the church because of this participation. All of this leading the pastor, Kathy McShane, this really wonderful quote to suggest that in her experience of 20 years of ministry, the Changemakers Initiative constitutes the most effective discipleship forming experience that she's seen, which I think is a remarkable comment. And I think says something important about the lines that are getting blurred here intentionally and helpfully. And in my description, in what I think of as a kind of intercessory embodiment of evangelism in the world. In the end, I'll just close with a word to say that in the end, I think this is my hope, at least, for the ways in which evangelism continues to be a central part of what we do in the life of the church, more effectively a part of the way we talk about who we are and what we do in the life of the church. That we are, of course, about the proclamation of the gospel, the sharing of good news, the formation of discipleship and holy lives, sanctified lives in the world. And that we also at the same time find our way to participate in that work of the Spirit that is at work in the world right now, even as we're having this conversation, right? The work of the Spirit in mission, reconciling all of creation. To be a part of all of that requires the church to stand in that space between God and the world, always leaning both ways at once. So that's where I'm going to stop, I think, at this point. And thank you, let me say again, for letting me continue to sort of unpack this for you and to think a little bit along these terms and to see what impact this may or may not have in our own imaginations for the work of the church. I've posed a few questions that I wonder we might made some time to talk about, if that's helpful, or other questions about anything that we've talked about or anything else that would be helpful to discuss. I want to open the door for that conversation, if that's okay, Heather, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's great. And I think as folks are coming up with their questions or coming up with answers to the questions that you've posed, do you have any sense or any specifics on how they took things in initiatives that might just be lumped in typically as justice, but isn't typically well connected with faith, or there's not, a lot of times churches don't do a good job putting faith reasons behind the good work. Do you know what kind of legwork and preparation that they included to help folks make those connections that we tend to bifurcate?
Specifically in regards to the Changemaker initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. I would, again, probably best refer you to their website and to learn more explicitly about how they think about that. But in my conversations with their director, and then in some subsequent exchange with one of the Changemakers, I posed, in a way, I kind of posed that question, right? Was to ask, how do you feel if you thought about this? Have you thought about this as a kind of evangelism in that sense? And what I heard back was something you saw in one of the slides that I shared earlier, right? That there was a way in which participation in this experience required preparation. It required formation, would be the word I would use. And the formation that it required was formation to understand, I think, both how do we think about the formation of a social initiative, a social innovation to address an issue in the community. That is work that is not explicitly or even entirely always, of course, theological work. There's secular organizations that pursue social innovation. And they are in partnership, actually, in this congregation with one of the most well-known. Ashoka is the organization. And so the training for the work of practicing social innovation was a part of the formation to be a part of this initiative. But so was an engagement, I think, in a more significant way with what it means to be a Christian disciple. I think there was an invitation to try to make these connections between that relationship more explicitly, so that those who participated, when you drill down into some of the initiatives, I think some of them you see have very explicit kinds of faith orientation in regards to the content of the program. Others don't have as much explicit sort of kind of Christian identity, if you want to put it that way. But it's very clear that the engagement is inspired by, shaped by a form of witness embodied by United Methodist Christians who are engaged in this community. And in that respect, it is a kind of witness. And certainly for those who are involved, it seems to me that there's a kind of shared sense that what we're doing is an expression of our faithfulness, it's expression of discipleship. And in that sense, it is service. It is a seeking of social witness. It's a kind of outreach. It fits those descriptions, but it doesn't not fit these other descriptions. And does that make room then to blur the lines for the kind of easy divisions we've lived with, where we keep evangelism in one space and we keep this other kind of work in another?
Yeah. So I would love to hear from the folks who are participating. Are there particular ministries that you're aware of or in your congregation where you've been able to do this work well? Practicing this intercession, leaning both ways at once, where you've been able to help folks make that connection? Or is that an area for growth for you, where your church tends to lean one way more than the other? Just kind of where do you find yourself in your context?
I used to say that in the church I served that I had there were sort of multiple overlapping functional ideas of the church. There were some people who really believed the church was there to worship God and to form holiness and to practice evangelism. But they were at times distinctly different from the group of people that really thought our job is to be here to be the hands and the feet of Christ in the community and to be a part of service. And they were the outreach committee, and the other was the work of the worship team and the prayer ministry. And these were like separate groups. And sometimes when they would they'd engage with each other, it would become clear that they didn't necessarily know at times how to talk about what they did in relation to the church with each other. They all understood they were part of the church, but they kind of thought, what you do isn't what I do. And what I do isn't what you do. And I thought, that doesn't seem right to me either. That it's all a part of this expression of Christian witness. So
Right. And how can they complement each other and learn from each other? I mean, that's our work to do together. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just trying to follow. I see that in the chat, there's some mention, of course, the ways that, the world, when I wrote this book, I want to almost suggest that the world was a less complicated place than it feels like it is now, if that's possible. It was before there was a pandemic, before there was, election chaos and tension in this country, before there was, I think, a sort of hard engagement with the realities of another pandemic that we have come to see and to name openly. Of course, that being pandemic of an ongoing, perpetuating racism in the country. And, I wish I could tell you, I thought there was some sort of secret engagement this book would offer that would really open the door to think about that more carefully. Um, but I'm not sure that I pivot off of what I'm trying to be committed to here, which is to say that that the witness, I think, that we are seeking to embody in the church has to consistently, it has to be always engaged in at the same time, a deep commitment to the formation of Christian identity, that we can't engage the world without that source of the Spirit's empowerment in us and in the peoplehood of the church. Our commitment to serve in the world is not at the expense of our commitment to continually seek to be a part of what God is doing. But it's also an acknowledgement that what God is doing is not solely happening inside the church, that it's also happening in the world. And this, of course, goes back to what we started with, that if the creation is indeed the world, or if the world is creation, then God is still the creator, and God is still at work in creation. And the church's task isn't to do this work for God, but rather to discern where God is at work and to try to seek to be a part of that creative, reconciling spirit in the world. That's a discernment every congregation, every peoplehood of the church has to do in every place where they're located. It's hard to make an account of how that looks in every place and every time. But the work has to be done in every place and in every time. And it's if it was there before us, when I feel like I wrote this, it feels like it's even more so now. Let me, if it's okay if I pivot and just look at the chat briefly. Yeah, so the comment, picking up for Michael, just picking up on the comment I made about sort of functional differentiated ecclesiologies in the church, right? People have got different ideas about what the church is for. What are some ideas for connecting the worship team with the outreach team? Yeah, some of that just frankly was making space where people had to cross paths with each other. And sometimes, this depends on the kind of church you're in, the size of that congregation. It just happened to be the size of the congregation that I was in. It was just big enough that circles of people could be engaged in the church without necessarily crossing paths with each other. And that I think led to the unfortunate result that sometimes we can sort of become siloed in the way we understand what it means to be a part of the church. And so frankly, one experiment that I tried to engage, there's nothing original about this at all. It was just taking the lead from Jesus and saying, could we eat together a little more regularly? Which of course is a huge challenge given our current circumstances, and all acknowledgement of that. But some of it was just intentionally trying to find spaces where people who wouldn't necessarily cross paths could cross paths, and to help shape some of the conversation. Some of that too, I think, has to do with I don't know if the work that you do in the church involves the work of preaching or teaching, but one way or the other, I think some of the task that we have too is to make sure that when we teach and we preach, we are attending to what it means to lean both ways at once as well, right? To attend to the fact that our witness is to the hope for the holiness and the formation of Christian identity, of Christian life, that people would find the joy of the good news of the gospel. I mean, that is still what we want to do. I'm not taking focus off of that at all. But at the same time, right, we're also called to this work that God calls us to intercede, to be engaged in the world, to carry the pain of the world to God and the hope of God to the world. And in that respect, that has to become part of the witness I offer to the congregation as well, to shape that imagination that we're a church that knows what it means to lean both ways at once. So I think
Yeah.
about
And
each other.
I was just gonna to add to that I think too, if to echo as far as from the pulpit through our studies, that we're really hitting on the why we're doing these outreach ministries. We're connecting it with scripture and our theology, but then also, is there space in our worship service for people to share testimony and stories of impact and transformation during those outreach projects and during that mission? How was I changed because I participated in this? Not just what nice things did we do for other people, but how was I able to grow in my faith and grow closer to God through service and helping people? That's hard to get people to be able to share that. It's something that requires coaching sometimes and helping to draw out those stories. But I think that's a really important thing, that we kind of cross-pollinate and we make space to tell those stories and infuse our already the things we're studying and the things we're preaching with the why of the social gospel.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so, I wish I had thought of to say that. So I think that's really right. I think in some ways, going back to what I was talking about in regards to the change makers, like that, it's testimony, that they're discovering. And I wonder if they use that language. I think it's really great language. I'm aware, of course, you mentioned, of course, Dr. Pope Levinson, who spoke at your webinar last week and is just getting underway with a project, I know, at Perkins School of Theology at SMU, Southern Methodist University, doing some focus on this ministry of testimony. And I'm excited about that. I'm kind of intrigued and excited about what will come of that, because testimony is a Christian practice. It's but the way that it blurs this line that we're trying to talk about, I think it absolutely does that work. And it seems like a right moment to do that. Yeah. I'm seeing that the comment about the virtual prayer live stream and the impact on the number of people that are engaging. I think that's fantastic. And it really also opens the door, which I think, everyone, whether they wanted to or not, had to walk through this last year, which was, what does it mean for us to do the work of the ministry and the mission of the church virtually? How do we do that given this technological intermediary? And I don't want to wade into all of what I think are a very thick set of theological questions related to, how far and how much and what's at stake. The sacramental questions that I think that have come up that are crucially important questions, I think. But I don't want to deny the fact that there's also what I think you're witnessing to in the comment in the chat, that there's some opportunity in some sense too. And how do we regard the use of the technology? How do we understand its engagement for this work of leaning both ways and to practice a kind of intercessory evangelism? Can we do that in this medium? What's at stake in it? I mean, what is gained is one set of questions we might ask, but the other side of it is, I think we must ask, what could be lost or what's at risk? And how do we account for that? And that's not to make a definitive or declarative statement about whether it's always good or always wrong for a congregation to engage that way. I, of course, with so many others, think that this is a part of the way we will do things going forward. That it won't stop being a part of our engagement. But the discernment, I think, necessary to try to understand, how do we engage the space? How are we doing it in a way where we really are witnessing to who we are as the church in the fullness of that identity, and also engaging faithfully with others, and in the hope that we're a part of the work of the Spirit, even if we can't necessarily be in embodied presence with one another in this particular time. So it seems like a really interesting set of questions, but also a really important opportunity, and in some ways also as all things are when we engage with the world, with some risk, and something that we have to be careful and discerning about, I think.
We're coming close to the end of our time. Any final questions or comments from the group here? Oh, okay. Got one more.
Yeah, that's great. A new ministry, just to engage people who are just in the space. We're never done, I think, trying to imagine how we can innovate and expand the welcome that we offer inside of the congregations we serve, and at the same time to imagine the possibilities of what could be done in the communities where we live outside of the church. Forming new kinds of Christian community, the conversation about fresh expressions and the formation of new kinds of Christian community, new kinds of church, but also again, engaging in these expressions of social innovation, partnerships with others who want to be a part of the common good, to be in the work of seeking the flourishing of communities. I trust this is what God hopes for in creation. And I trust this is the kind of work the church always knows it must be a part of. Where is the Spirit at work where you are? And how can you try to be a part of that? To lean into God and to lean into the world, and to trust that God is already doing it, and God hopes for you to join and to be a part of that ministry and to be a part of that mission.
That's right.
I hope for the same.
Yeah, and I think to constantly keep leaning both ways at once. How do we don't just lean into the world one time and then develop your ministry for the next 10 years, but how do we keep listening? Because our context changes, both internally and externally, to listen and to match our gifts and strengths with needs and opportunities in the community, but also ground that in prayer, that we're leaning into God. Can't recommend Jeff's book enough to you all. Hope everybody goes out and gets a copy. He shared his contact information here with you, and has graciously invited you to, as you watch this down the road or get off tonight and you have more questions, follow up with him. Thank you for that offer, Jeff. We appreciate it. And I just want to thank Jeff, especially. Always thanks to Jason for monitoring things behind the scenes and making sure everything goes smoothly, and encourage you to check out our website at foundationforevangelism.org. There's more resources, webinars, studies for your church, as well as ways that you can come alongside us in our work. But thank you all for joining us tonight. We know everybody's spending a lot of time on the computer these days and on Zoom. So for spending just another hour, we're grateful, and thank you for your participation. And as we sign off tonight, just pray blessings on all of you and your ministries and your communities as we seek to do this work of leaning both ways at once. Thank you again, Jeff. And Jason, I'll turn it over to you to sign us off for the night.
All right. Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As a reminder, the entire session was recorded. The playback will be posted on the Foundation for Evangelism's website. I've put the link there in the chat. And as you leave today, actually, another tab will open up automatically on your web browser and take you right to those resources so that you can bookmark them right away. So that does it for us tonight. Thank you for joining us. We wish you a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.